They say the most ruthless men are born with hearts of stone. Arthur Rossi was about to crush a helpless woman's livelihood just to build a luxury high-rise. But a single haunting melody and a shattered mirror changed everything. This is a story of blood, betrayal, and a devastating redemption. Arthur Rossi wasn't the kind of mafia boss who broke legs in dark, rain-slicked alleyways. He was a modern operator, a man who broke legacies in corner offices and boardroom suites. As the quiet but undisputed head of the Chicago Syndicate's financial wing, Arthur's weapon of choice wasn't a revolver. It was a briefcase, a network of shell companies and the municipal zoning board. He wore bespoke Brioni suits, drank 25-year-old Macallan, and held discreet meetings with city aldermen at the back tables of Gibson's Bar and Steakhouse. To the public, he was a ruthless but legitimate real estate developer. To the underworld, he was the untouchable architect of laundering billions. His latest obsession was the Fulton Market District. His front company, Omnicorp Holdings, had spent the last 2 years quietly buying up an entire city block to construct a massive $300 million commercial and residential complex. The bribes were paid, the permits were rubber-stamped by dirty officials, and the demolition crews were on standby. There was only one problem left: a stubborn, 80-year-old jazz lounge sitting dead in the center of his blueprint. The club was called the Crimson Note. It was a dilapidated brick building that looked like it belonged to a forgotten era, wedged stubbornly between sleek new coffee shops and modern art galleries. The owner was a 30-year-old woman named Genevieve Miller. She had inherited the debt-ridden venue after her father's sudden passing 6 months prior. Arthur had sent his lawyers with a generous buyout offer 3 times the market value. Genevieve had torn the contract in half and mailed it back to his corporate office. Arthur did not take rejection well. Sitting in his penthouse overlooking the magnificent Mile, Arthur tossed the torn pieces of the contract onto his mahogany desk. Across from him stood Vincent, his brutal and fiercely loyal underboss. Vincent was old-school, a man who preferred gasoline and matches to litigation. "She's a naive girl drowning in her father's debt to Chase Bank," Arthur said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that commanded absolute silence in any room. "She doesn't understand the machinery she's standing in front of. Grind her down, quietly. I don't want any police sirens bringing the local news to my construction site." Vincent nodded, a cold smile touching his lips. "How far do we take it, boss?" "Cut off her oxygen," Arthur instructed, pouring himself a measure of scotch. "Call our friends at the local unions. Make sure the beverage distributors refuse to deliver to her address. Call the Department of Public Health. Have them find rat droppings in her kitchen, even if they have to bring the rats themselves. Intimidate her waitstaff. Squeeze the life out of the Crimson Note until she comes crawling to my office, begging me to buy the deed for pennies on the dollar." Over the next 4 weeks, the invisible hand of the syndicate closed around Genevieve's throat. It started with the inventory. Genevieve's regular shipments of liquor from local suppliers abruptly ceased. Drivers claimed her address was blacklisted due to unpaid invoices, despite her showing them the cleared checks from her bank. When she tried to buy supplies out of pocket from wholesale warehouses, her tires were slashed in the parking lot. Then came the bureaucratic assault. The city's fire marshal showed up unannounced, slapping the venue with thousands of dollars in fines for code violations that hadn't been an issue for 4 decades. The health inspector followed a day later, shutting down her small kitchen indefinitely. The psychological toll was even worse. Heavy, intimidating men in leather jackets began occupying the front booths during her busiest nights. They didn't order drinks. They didn't speak. They simply stared at the waitstaff and the few remaining patrons, creating an atmosphere of sheer terror. Within 3 weeks, her bartender of 5 years quit, apologizing through tears. and the loyal customer base that had sustained the Crimson Note dried up completely. Genevieve was isolated, financially ruined, and emotionally exhausted. Every night she sat in the back office, staring at the growing pile of final notice bills, the red ink mocking her desperate attempts to hold on to the only piece of her father she had left. Arthur watched the collapse from a distance, receiving daily updates from Vincent. It was a textbook operation, cold, efficient, detached. He felt no remorse. In Arthur's world, sentimentality was a fatal disease. Genevieve Miller was just a bug on the windshield of progress, and he was the speeding trap. She missed her mortgage payment yesterday, Vincent reported one evening, stepping into Arthur's office as the city lights flickered to life outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. The bank is preparing to foreclose, but she's still stubbornly keeping the doors open every night. Just her and that old piano. Arthur frowned. The stubbornness defied logic. Why suffer? Why not surrender and walk away with something rather than nothing? It irritated him. It was an irrationality he couldn't plot on a spreadsheet. I want her out by the end of the week, Arthur muttered, adjusting his silk tie. I'm tired of waiting. I'll go see her myself tonight. I want to look her in the eye when I break the final piece of her spirit. The rain was falling in heavy, relentless sheets when Arthur's Blacktown car pulled up to the curb across from the Crimson Note. The neon sign above the door was half broken, buzzing weakly as it cast a flickering red glow onto the wet pavement. Arthur told his driver to wait. He stepped out into the storm, the collar of his Tom Ford overcoat turned up against the chill. He didn't bring Vincent. He didn't need muscle for a broken, bankrupt woman. He walked across the street, pushed open the heavy oak door, and stepped into the venue. The club was entirely empty. The air smelled of old wood, stale whiskey, and the sharp tang of rain. The chairs were stacked upside down on the tables. The bar was stripped bare. The only light came from a single spotlight aimed at the small stage in the back corner of the room. Arthur walked slowly across the hardwood floor, his leather shoes masking his approach. He expected to find a woman weeping over ledgers or packing boxes in defeat. Instead, he found Genevieve Miller sitting at a vintage, beaten-up Steinway grand piano. Her back was mostly to him. Her dark hair fell in loose, tired waves over her shoulders. She wasn't packing. She wasn't crying. She was playing. Her fingers moved across the yellowed ivory keys with a desperate, heavy grace. The chords she struck were dark, complex, and overwhelmingly sad. Then she began to sing. Arthur stopped dead in his tracks. Her voice wasn't just beautiful, it was a raw, bleeding wound. It carried a depth of sorrow that seized Arthur by the throat. She was singing an old, obscure blues ballad, a song about a man who built a castle of gold only to realize he had walled himself inside a tomb. It was a song of isolation, of losing one's soul to the dark, and the crushing weight of sins that could never be washed away. He traded his heart for a crown of rust. Now his kingdom of shadows is turning to dust, she sang, her voice echoing off the empty brick walls, fragile yet immensely powerful. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. Arthur's chest tightened, an involuntary physical reaction to the sheer, unadulterated pain in her voice. It was as if she were reaching directly into the locked, blackened vault of his chest and dragging his deepest, most suppressed demons into the light. He took a slow step to the side, trying to steady his breathing. As he moved, he caught his own reflection in the massive, antique, mirrored wall that ran alongside the stage. Arthur froze. He stared at himself. He saw the expensive coat, the perfectly styled hair, the aura of wealth and power, but as Genevieve's haunting voice swelled, filling the empty room with the echoes of lost souls, the illusion of the successful businessman dissolved. In that mirror, he saw the 20-year-old boy he used to be, the boy who had watched his father, get gunned down on a Brooklyn sidewalk. He saw the first man he had ever killed, the blood seeping into his hands, the terrifying realization that he could never go back. He saw the hollow, ruthless monster he had become to survive the syndicate man who destroyed families, corrupted cities, and crushed innocent women like the one sitting 10 feet away from him, all for a parking garage. He wasn't an architect. He was a parasite. Genevieve hit a minor chord that lingered in the air, letting the final note fade into the silence of the empty club. She let her hands drop to her lap, her shoulders slumping in total exhaustion. Arthur stood perfectly still in the shadows, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. The man who walked into the Crimson Note with the intent to destroy had vanished. In his place was a man paralyzed by a sudden, violent crisis of conscience. He had planned to strip her of everything. Instead, she had unknowingly stripped him bare, forcing him to look at the rot inside his own soul. Genevieve finally sensed she wasn't alone. She turned slowly on the piano bench. Her eyes striking, fiercely intelligent but ringed with deep shadows of fatigue, met his. She didn't look scared. She just looked incredibly tired. "If you're from the bank," Genevieve said, her voice raspy from singing, "you're a few days early. The locks don't get changed until Friday." Arthur opened his mouth to speak, to introduce himself as Arthur Rossi, the man responsible for every tear she had shed over the past month. But the words died in his throat. He couldn't do it. Looking into her eyes, he felt a sickening wave of self-disgust. "I'm not from the bank," Arthur managed to say, his voice softer than it had been in a decade. I just heard the music from the street." Genevieve offered a bitter, half-broken smile. "Well, you got a private show. It's the last one. We're closed, permanently." Arthur took a step forward, a desperate urge washing over him to fix this, to undo the machinery of ruin he had set into motion. "You don't have to close. I know people. I can help you." Before Genevieve could respond to the strange man in the $3,000 coat offering her salvation, Arthur's cell phone buzzed violently in his pocket. He pulled it out. It was a text from Vincent. "Decided to speed up the timeline, boss. Left you a present. Building burns in 10 minutes. Collect the insurance money from the ashes." Arthur's blood ran ice cold. He looked up, his eyes darting toward the back hallway of the club. A faint, unmistakable smell began to overpower the scent of rain and stale whiskey. The heavy, suffocating stench of gasoline. Vincent hadn't waited. The arsonist was already inside. The heavy, cloying scent of gasoline sliced through the damp air of the Crimson Note, instantly snapping Arthur Rossi out of his emotional paralysis. The Sing-the-Christ was moving. Vincent had bypassed him. "Get up," Arthur barked, his voice cracking like a whip. The sudden, violent shift in his demeanor made Genevieve jolt on the piano bench. "What?" she stammered, confusion clouding her exhausted eyes. "I said get up, now." Arthur lunged forward, grabbing her by the wrist. He didn't have time for etiquette or explanations. He hauled her to her feet just as a dull, thunderous one walks echoed from the back kitchen. A heartbeat later, a wall of brilliant, blinding orange flame rolled out from the service hallway. The fire caught the ancient dry wood of the club's interior with terrifying speed, hungrily crawling up the velvet curtains and licking at the ceiling joists. The heat hit them like a physical blow, instantly evaporating the damp chill of the Chicago rain. "My father's piano," Genevieve screamed, trying to pull against Arthur's iron grip as the smoke rapidly descended from the ceiling, thick and acrid. "It's wood and wire. It's gone." Arthur roared over the crackle of the flames. "Move!" He dragged her toward the front entrance, coughing as the black smoke filled his lungs. He hit the heavy oak doors shoulder first, expecting them to yield to the wet street outside. They didn't budge. He pushed again, throwing his entire weight against the brass push bar. Nothing. Through the narrow glass panes at the top of the doors, Arthur saw the thick steel chain wrapped around the exterior handles, secured with a heavy-duty padlock. Vincent's men were thorough. They hadn't just come to burn the building. They had come to make sure the bankrupt owner couldn't escape the tragic, accidental fire. "We're trapped," Genevieve choked out, tears of panic and smoke stinging her eyes. She leaned against the wall, covering her mouth with her sleeve. Arthur's mind, usually processing stock fluctuations and zoning laws, calculated survival odds with cold precision. He spun around, scanning the rapidly deteriorating room. The flames had already consumed the bar, shattering bottles of cheap whiskey that served as extra fuel. "The alley window," Arthur said, pointing to a frosted glass pane near the coat check. He didn't wait for her to move. He sprinted to the nearest table, grabbed a heavy, cast-iron base bar stool, and hurled it with everything he had at the frosted glass. The window shattered outward in an explosion of jagged shards. "Go," he yelled, practically lifting Genevieve through the broken frame. The jagged edges tore at his expensive Tom Ford coat and sliced his forearm as he vaulted through after her, tumbling into the wet, garbage-strewn alleyway. They collapsed onto the wet asphalt, gasping for the cold, rain-soaked air. Sirens were already wailing in the distance, a sound Arthur usually paid millions to avoid. As Arthur pushed himself up to his knees, clutching his bleeding arm, the heavy crunch of tires on gravel echoed at the end of the alley. A black Lincoln Navigator blocked the exit. The headlights pinned them in the dark. Two men stepped out of the vehicle. Arthur recognized them immediately. Dominic and Luca, Vincent's top enforcers. They held heavy maglights and looked down the alley to inspect their handiwork. "Hey, nobody gets out!" Dominic shouted, reaching inside his leather jacket. Arthur stood up, stepping deliberately in front of Genevieve, shielding her. He walked toward the headlights, his face illuminated by the harsh beams. "Stand down, Dominic," Arthur commanded. His voice was no longer the frantic yell of a man escaping a fire. It was the chilling, absolute authority of the syndicate boss. Dominic froze, his hand still inside his jacket. Luca dropped his flashlight. Both men stared in utter disbelief at the impeccably dressed, now soot-stained man standing before them. "Mr. Rossi?" Dominic stammered, all the blood draining from his face. "Boss? What? What the hell are you doing in there?" Vincent said the building was empty. Behind Arthur, Genevieve stopped coughing. The rain beat down on the alley, but the world seemed to go dead silent. She slowly pushed herself off the brick wall, her eyes wide with a horrific realization. She looked at the men deferring to him. She looked at the blood dripping from his hand. She heard the name, Mr. Rossi. "Arthur Rossi," Genevieve whispered, her voice trembling not with fear, but with an absolute bottomless rage. Omnicorp Holdings. Arthur closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. The collision of his two worlds was absolute. He turned to face her, the flickering light of her burning legacy casting long shadows across his face. "Genevieve, listen to me." Smack. Her hand struck his cheek with a force that snapped his head to the side. The ring on her finger cut his lip, drawing a fresh bead of blood. "You did this," she breathed, her chest heaving as she pointed a shaking finger at the inferno consuming the crimson note. "The health inspectors, the delivery drivers, the men intimidating my staff. It wasn't the universe giving me bad luck. It was you. You tortured me for a month, and then you set my father's legacy on fire." "I didn't order the fire," Arthur said, his voice terrifyingly calm despite the storm inside him. "But I ordered everything else, yes." He didn't lie. He couldn't lie to her. Not after she had stripped his soul bare with a single song. Genevieve backed away from him as if he were carrying the plague. The sirens grew deafening as 2 Chicago Fire Department trucks turned onto Fulton Market. "You are a monster," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh, broken whisper. "You broke my life to steal my land, and now what? You want a medal for pulling me out of the fire." Before Arthur could answer, she turned and ran out the opposite end of the alley, disappearing into the chaotic flashing lights of the arriving fire engines. Arthur didn't chase her. He couldn't. He stood in the rain, watching the roof of the Crimson Note collapse inward in a shower of sparks. Dominic cleared his throat nervously. "Boss, Vincent is going to want to know what happened." Arthur pulled out a silk handkerchief, wiped the blood from his split lip, and turned to his enforcers. The guilt and self-loathing in his chest rapidly crystallized into something much more dangerous: absolute, unadulterated vengeance. "Tell Vincent to meet me at the office," Arthur said, his eyes dead and cold. "We have a structural issue to discuss." Arthur Rossi did not build his empire with bullets. He built it with ledgers, shell companies, and blackmail. And if a man knows how to build a house, he knows exactly which load-bearing walls to knock down to make it collapse. By 3 a.m., Arthur was sitting at the massive mahogany desk in his penthouse on the magnificent Mile. Vincent sat across from him, entirely unapologetic about the fire. "It was a calculated risk, Arthur," Vincent argued, pouring himself a drink. The commission was getting impatient. The Fulton Market project was stalling because of one stubborn broad. "I handled it. The insurance payout will cover her debts to Chase Bank, and we seized the land." Arthur stared at Vincent, tapping a silver Montblanc pen against his desk. "You acted without my authorization. You nearly burned me alive." "I didn't know you were in there," Vincent snapped back. "What the hell were you doing there anyway? Sizing up the drapes?" "I was looking at my reflection," Arthur said quietly. Vincent scoffed. "You're losing your edge, boss." "The commission is noticing. Let them notice," Arthur replied. He pressed a button on his intercom. "Send them in." The heavy double doors to Arthur's office swung open. It wasn't syndicate muscle that walked in. It was 4 armed FBI agents led by Special Agent Thomas Kessler from the Chicago Field Office's Organized Crime Division. Vincent leapt to his feet, reaching for his waist, but 3 laser sights immediately painted his chest. He froze, his eyes darting to Arthur in sheer betrayal. "What is this?" Vincent hissed, spitting the words. "You're a rat? I am the architect," Arthur corrected smoothly, standing up and buttoning his suit jacket. "And I am tearing the building down." Over the next 48 hours, the Chicago underworld experienced a seismic earthquake. Arthur didn't just turn in Vincent. He handed Agent Kessler a meticulously encrypted hard drive containing 10 years of Omnicorp Holdings' illicit transactions. He exposed the offshore accounts at Credit Suisse, the money laundering fronts in the South Loop, and the names of 3 corrupt aldermen on the zoning board who had rubber-stamped the Fulton Market project. Arthur had triggered the financial equivalent of a nuclear bomb. He transferred the remaining legitimate $300 million in Omnicorp's development funds into an untouchable, blind, charitable trust. He froze the syndicate's liquidity entirely. Without money, the mob couldn't pay its lawyers, its enforcers, or its bribes. The machine ground to a halt. Because Arthur had masterminded the evidence, his high-priced lawyers negotiated a highly classified, heavily restricted proffer agreement. He wasn't walking away free, he was stripped of all his assets, placed under a mountain of federal surveillance, and given a 5-year suspended sentence with 10,000 hours of community service in exchange for dismantling the largest crime syndicate in the Midwest. He lost his penthouse, he lost his wealth, he lost his power, and for the first time in his life, Arthur Rossi slept soundly. 6 months later, the Fulton Market District was bustling with late autumn foot traffic. The air was crisp, and the leaves on the newly planted trees were turning golden red. Arthur walked down the pavement, his hands shoved into the pockets of a simple, worn peacoat. There was no driver trailing him, no Tom Ford suit. He blended in seamlessly with the locals, a ghost of the man who used to own the skyline. He stopped in front of the address that used to be a burnt-out shell. It was no longer a ruin. It had been beautifully rebuilt, keeping the vintage brick aesthetic but reinforced with modern architecture. The neon sign above the door didn't buzz or flicker. It glowed a warm, steady crimson, the crimson note. Arthur hesitated, then pushed open the heavy oak doors. The interior was breathtaking. The smell of fresh pine and polished mahogany filled the air. Patrons sat at candlelit tables, laughing and clinking glasses of wine. The waitstaff moved seamlessly through the room. It was alive. On the stage, sitting at a brand-new polished Yamaha grand piano, was Genevieve. She looked radiant. The deep shadows of exhaustion were gone from her eyes. She wore a deep red dress, her hands dancing across the keys as she played a lively, upbeat jazz standard that filled the room with warmth. Arthur stood in the back, near the coat check, content to simply watch. He had insured the $300 million blind trust he created specifically designated the Crimson Note as a protected cultural heritage site, permanently immune from corporate buyouts or property taxes. He had paid her debt to Chase Bank in full before his assets were seized. He didn't expect a thank you. He didn't expect forgiveness. He just needed to know she was okay. The song ended and the crowd erupted into applause. Genevieve smiled, taking a small bow from the bench. As she looked out over the room, her eyes caught movement by the back door. She stopped. The smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of intense, complicated recognition. Arthur gave her a slow, respectful nod. He turned to leave, not wanting to ruin her night with his presence. "Hey." Arthur paused, his hand on the brass push bar at the door. He turned around. Genevieve had stepped off the stage and walked through the crowd. She stopped a few feet away from him. She looked at his worn coat. She looked at the lack of arrogance in his posture. She had read the news. The whole city had. The mysterious fall of Omnicorp, the arrest of Vincent and the alderman, and the miraculous anonymous trust that had saved her block. "I hear you're out of the real estate business," Genevieve said softly, her striking eyes searching his face. "I found I didn't have the stomach for demolition anymore," Arthur replied, a self-deprecating smile touching his lips. "The new place looks beautiful, Genevieve. I'm glad your father's legacy survived." Genevieve crossed her arms, studying him. The anger that had burned between them in the alley 6 months ago was gone, replaced by a cautious, fragile curiosity. "The trust sent me the deed, along with a letter explaining that the block is permanently protected. I know it was you, Arthur. Consider it restitution," he said quietly, "a down payment on a debt I can never fully repay." "You burned down your own empire," she noted, "just to make sure I got to keep mine?" Arthur looked at her, truly looking into the eyes of the woman who had inadvertently saved his soul. "A wise woman once sang to me about a man who traded his heart for a crown of rust. I just decided I wanted my heart back." A faint, genuine smile finally broke through Genevieve's cautious exterior. "It takes a lot of work to rebuild after a fire. It takes time." "I have nothing but time," Arthur said. Genevieve stepped forward, closing the distance between them. She reached out, gently touching the scar on his forearm where the glass had cut him that night. "My piano player called in sick tonight. The second set starts in 10 minutes. If you want to sit at a back table and listen, I wouldn't object." Arthur felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. He took his hand off the door handle. "I'd like that very much," Arthur said. As Genevieve walked back to the stage, Arthur sat at a small, empty table in the corner. He wasn't a boss anymore. He wasn't a monster. He was just a man in a jazz club, listening to the music, ready to finally start building something real. From a ruthless syndicate boss to a man willing to sacrifice his entire empire for a second chance of a soul, Arthur and Genevieve's story proves that sometimes the most beautiful things are built from the ashes of our darkest mistakes. Did you love this explosive mafia romance? Like this video, share it with your fellow drama lovers, and subscribe to the channel for more intense twist-filled stories.